Let's have a verbal confirmation. Is OG here and complete?
Yep, we're both here.
How about OO? OO, are you here and complete? Okay, so OO is still not here. How about CG? Are you here and complete?
We're here.
How about CO?
My partner still hasn't joined, but she's joining right now.
All right. How about OO? Are you here? Are you here, OO? I'll tag them. Let's just wait. How about the panelists? Ayafa, are you here?
Yeah, I'm here.
How about Mohammed Habib? So Mohammed is still not here. I'll ping them also in the missing in Discord. Hello, OO, are you here? Alright, CO is complete. We're waiting for OO. If you would, while waiting for OO, can teams submit or indicate in the chats their speaker positions and their PUI preference, because for it to be easier in the debate later on to track. All right, we're still waiting for OO. OO's here. All right. We're just waiting for the other panel to enter here, and I'm just waiting for the ARCOM to also give me a heads up or a thumbs up to start the round. Mohammed Habib, are you here? And while also waiting.
Oh, yes, I'm
Hi.
currently on call.
All right, all right. Thank you very much. So reminding also everyone that the room is recorded. If you want to retract your consent, you may after after the debate, and also so yeah, you can fill it out as well in the forms that was provided earlier, and is also accessible to the Discord. Anyways, hello everyone. Welcome to the semifinals of the Hart House Summer Open 2023. My name is Jor. I'm going to be the chair for this round. Paneling with me are Ayafa and Mohammed. If you could introduce yourselves, that would be great.
Hey
My
guys,
name is okay.
I'm Ayafa. I go by he, him pronouns. Best of luck, guys.
Hey, my name is Mohammed. I don't have to prepared for now. Best of luck, guys.
All right. Thank you very much for that. Take note, or I prefer for you to call us as a panel as a whole, even if I'm the chair. All right. So a few reminders before we start the round, please. I will be timing in a text. I will be timing here on my own, but I will also send timestamps. But I really encourage you debaters to time yourself. Second, Please be mindful of the equity policies. Third, mindful of the POI preferences of your opponents and also the POI rule. All right, so if everyone is here and complete, we shall start the round. Calling the House into order, debating on the motion. This House regrets the imposition of the neoliberal world order, calling on the Prime Minister to open up this debate. Here.
All right, awesome. Am I audible?
Yep, you're audible.
Lovely. I'm Andre, he, him, and pronouns, not pronouns. POIs, however, is fine. Chat, verbal, whatever. I have the chat open. Panel, we think that the neoliberal world order has led to two things in our world. It has led to conflict and has led to inequalities. We think it's been bad for both developing and developed nations. First then, on just the economics in general. In a neoliberal world order, why does wealth tend to flow towards the top? So imagine that we started off, right, because this House regrets motion, where, there's moderate inequalities within society. It's not massive. But then what ends up happening is that those at the top are then able to consolidate their power, and there's several reasons for this. The first is because of economies of scale. What this means is companies get bigger and bigger. As they get bigger, they can do things like specialize. They can do things like buy goods for cheaper. They can buy natural resources for cheaper. What this means that is they're able to lower their prices. They can attract, they can stave off their competitors. What ends up happening is most sectors become just a few companies. That's why, for example, consider airplanes. We just have Boeing and Airbus. In Canada, banks, we only have 5 major banks. Most sectors do tend towards oligopolies because of economies of scale. What does this mean? When companies are this big, the market can only contain so many of them. So it's only going to be a few of these companies. What ends up happening then is these companies are better able to collude, to work with each other in order to do things like keep prices high for consumers and keep wages low for workers. Second mechanism here, though, is that these big companies also have the ability, as they get bigger, to lobby against things like regulation, to lobby against things like protection for workers. But third, those with capital, those who have moderately more resources, they're able to do things like invest in capital, whereas everyone else is kind of stuck working at a salaried wage. This doesn't grow, and then they get screwed over. But also, protection for those at the bottom are limited, given that free market, by definition, means that there's less people to stand up for them. Sure, go ahead with your PLC.
How does the imposition happen in the first place?
How does the imposition of the neoliberal world order happen? We think that, one of the ways is obviously, companies begin to kind of push this, companies lobby governments to do this. We think that developed countries are likely to push this on developing countries. I'll talk more about that later. And I think it's just kind of an ideology that spreads. Okay, second, what does this mean? It means that over time, slight inequalities get exacerbated, things get worse and worse as wealth continues to flow towards the top. But once wealth ends up at the top, then what happens? Well, because these people now have more and more wealth, it becomes more difficult to take it away because they now have more control over economic and political systems, through things like lobbying, through things like bribery of politicians, through things like just campaign donations. They're better able to ensure that they hold on to their wealth. So over time, not only do these inequalities exist, but it becomes far more difficult to tackle them. And these inequality sounds like a vague word, but it has very real tangible impacts on people. It means that minimum wage workers cannot afford to get by. It means that people cannot afford to put food on the table. It means that the climate crisis gets worse. These are very real tangible impacts. To be clear, on our side, we're not necessarily advocating for socialism, but we do think that we need a lot more intervention, government intervention. And I think another thing about giving rich people less resources, they're less able to lobby against other societal changes we see beneficial. I think one of the biggest is effective climate policy. But now, moving on then to developing countries. Why is this problematic in those countries? We have rich countries, they go and they interfere in these places to quote unquote spread their values. What are their incentives to go in? They're twofold. First of all, they have ulterior motives. They want oil. Everyone likes to joke about the US wanting oil. Maybe it's not necessarily oil, natural resources. They see opportunities for their own companies to go there, set up factories, right? But second is they want to tick off a box. Spreading democracy, check, done. But what happens when they go? No, thank you. What happens when they go in? Well, they take what they want and they leave. These politicians Western politicians have no incentive to care about the local people, at least not as much as their voters back home. Right? So we have developing countries that have been wrecked by years of colonization, legacy of monarchies. It takes a lot of resources to properly set up democratic and free economic systems in these countries. But these are resources then that these wealthy Western countries are not willing to invest. Why invest money in helping a developing countries set up their court system when you can just invade, be like, hey, we're helping you with democracy, get a couple campaign points at home and then dip. The result is then they meddle, there's some conflict, they get out there, the people in those countries get screwed over. People hurt in conflict, they die, it destabilizes the region. Right, as governments, as Western governments want to spread quote unquote these values, they're often likely to, kind of remove existing politicians so that they're able to implant their new people. This leads to things like destabilization, but also economically, it just becomes more difficult for these areas to then develop their own industries as a result of the instability caused. But also, by imposing these values of free market, what this allows is Western countries to come in, take advantage of workers in those nations. Sure, it does give them jobs in the short run, but now rich countries have this lovely source of cheap goods. They don't want to lose that. The result is then they have an incentive to keep these developing countries trapped in the cycle of only, making low-wage things, of continuing to exploit them, never allowing them to climb out of this trap. They never experience any development. On our side, we allow these countries to be more protectionist. We allow these countries to develop on their own because there's no neoliberal world order being like, hey, open up your free market. Hey, deregulate, whatever, to develop on their own without having this imposed on them. Yes, we accept this as a more gradual process, but we get better long-run playoffs. I think a couple miscellaneous things. First of all, structural adjustment policies. I think the info site talks about this, so I'll briefly mention this. We think that these are extremely harmful because, the people imposing these conditions are Western lenders who are more concerned about getting paid back, about potentially even making money off these loans than actually about helping these countries. Second piece of framing, we still get democracy on our side. People want freedom. They're going to fight for it. The thing is, the people in those countries get it on their own terms, as opposed to having Western countries go in and impose this world order on them. What do we get? We get greater equity. We protect developing nations. We get better economic outcomes. We get more equal distributions of not only wealth, but also power. We are so proud to propose.
All right, thank you for that, Prime Minister. Now to open up the class for the opposition, let's welcome Leader of Opposition. Here.
All right. Just as a clarification, I take my POIs in chat, but with that said, time begins on my first word. I want to first be clear on how this imposition happens. This happens when organizations like the IMF and World Bank adopt these policies and lend out support depending on the margin of degree countries make towards changing towards neoliberalism world orders. This is like lending out more financial aid when countries that are developing do this in the first place. But crucially, this is largely supported by countries that bankroll international institutions like the US, who want to gain strategic consolidation within these areas by developing their economies. This debate then is about developing countries with weaker economic policy because the West is usually already developed and is not affected by neoliberal world order. Most of the refutation against Andre will be integrated two arguments, one about developing economies and secondly about democracy. Firstly, about developing economies. The premise of this argument is that neoliberal world orders grant developing economies the necessary structures to survive. And there's two reasons for this. Firstly, just on foreign investment, because when your economic policy is centered around neoliberalism, this actually attracts Western investment. And this is because the West right now has already been succeeding a lot in terms of investment, which means that Western infrastructure is built to a point where it's unprofitable to continue business in the West by investing. This is why investors specifically look out towards investing into poor developing economies in order to attract themselves better revenue returns. Why is this a tipping point when you instill this policy then? Firstly, many state-owned industries develop a natural monopoly regardless. So there's less incentive to move into a country in the first place if there's already a dominated state monopoly already. And that means then that there's less incentive on props world to actually attract foreign investment because you already have a natural monopoly formed regardless in countries like Nigeria and Sri Lanka. This means then that on our side of the house, you're more likely to introduce greater competitive flow because now the state has less policies that actually contract and give itself a natural monopoly. This means you're more likely to have increased foreign multinationals visiting the country. You have more locally operated business that are bankrolled by foreign investment in the first place. Naturally, this is good because more people are able to access jobs on our side of the house on the ground. In a previous world, they would have to be employed by these natural monopolies where the state is unaccountable and where the state usually doesn't care about its own people like in many developing economies. On our side of the house, we get this accountability, but we also are able to give these people a better living wage because you have competition between more foreign multinationals, you get better development in these areas. Additionally, you also get the creation of alliances that naturally happen as a result of the globalization you get. Countries are more stable on our side of the house, and usually developing country regions are more stable on our side of the house. This looks like the creation of other BRICS unions that are funded onto developing poorer countries in the first place. But the second reason as to why you develop economies is just on foreign accountability. Because right now, if many developing economies hold limited strands of accountability by their people, because a lot of developing economies like Russia want to care towards their oligarchs, this is better on our side of the house because on our side of the house, you at least have foreign investment that can control accountability onto these groups. So firstly, consumer choice on our side of the house dictates what gets produced and how it gets produced on our side of the house in terms of goods. Additionally, the government is far more accountable on our side of the house because on their side of the house, they have a state monopoly to which everybody is employed under. On our side of the house, you have a variety of options to which individuals can choose which state they go to, who they pay, or who they work under, which means that you have a greater amount of freedom on our side of the house. And that leads to accountability because now governments have people who they have to compete with. The implication of this is threefold. Firstly, on poverty, this means that we're able to pay people better living wages. We're able to improve the quality of life of people on the ground, and we're able to reduce the oppression on them in the first place. Secondly, on innovation, developing countries do not want to change or cannot change because they have a limited amount of money and because they're already succeeding. On our side of the house, you make them focus more on innovation, or foreign multinationals who have more cash on hand are able to develop this innovation in the first place. This means you're more likely to get other surveillance benefits, such as green tech, or for example, just better forms of developing in terms of the economy. But thirdly, natural monopolies are way worse than artificial monopolies just on speed, because getting a natural monopoly in the developing world is much easier than getting an artificial monopoly that happens through competition. So on their side of the house, the speed to which you actually get natural monopolies is way faster, meaning that the casualties you get from them are also way higher. Why does this argument matter? Firstly, helping the most vulnerable often stabilizes the entire region of turmoil because individuals stop caring about their immediate concerns and focus on long-term benefits. But secondly, you're able to improve the lives of people. This is fairly intuitive. Second argument about democracy. Spreading democracy is a good thing in and of itself and is only achievable through neoliberalism. Here's why. Because consumer demand dictates what's important in the country, so now consumers just have more freedom of choice. But secondly, individuals can cover issues that are more important than them that the government might be blindsided to, such as the environment, such as people on the ground who might be starving by poverty just to government negligence. This can be covered on our side of the house when individuals have more freedom under who they work under due to free market politics. It's for those reasons we're very proud to oppose.
All right, thank you for that, Leader of Opposition. Now, to rebuild for the case of the opening government, let's welcome Deputy Prime Minister. Here.
All right, just give me a second to set up my timer. Opening opposition wants to talk about developing nations. Sure, I'm willing to do that because neoliberalism is particularly bad for developing nations. Developing nations are going to, first of all, be forced to buy into neoliberalism. They're going to be targeted by wealthier nations that know they have the power to exploit them, and wealthy nations have the incentive to do this because they will benefit more from it. They're strong-armed into buying into neoliberalism because wealthier nations have power and can employ various coercive measures to ensure this happens. But if in the end, the impacts on these countries are still good, then sure, perhaps this coercion isn't that bad. But I'd like to point out that neoliberalism has extremely destructive impacts on these nations' stability, on the welfare of these nations' citizens. I'm going to talk about that in my speech. Firstly, I'd like to respond to what comes out of opening opposition. There are three responses to their first argument, and their argument is essentially about how developing nations are going to be benefited because there's going to be foreign direct investment. The first response, foreign direct investment ultimately benefits those in the West or those who are investing. These benefits often don't trickle down to the developing nation. The second response, workers hired locally often tend to be exploited. And I want to note on the top that there will always be demand for labor. So multinational corporations don't need to compete for labor, as in there will always be more people than there is spots at jobs. So this is insufficient mitigation. The mechanism for why neoliberalism directly leads to exploitation is that protectionist policies would make the products of exploited labor less attractive because they wouldn't have the competitive advantage of being cheaper. It is intuitive to me that in the absence of these policies, the incentive to exploit labor increases. Multinational corporations will have a strong grip on these nations. They have access to more capital, they can afford factories, they can sell goods for cheaper. These corporations don't care about the people involved. They see them as a means to an end. Because of the control these nations are under, they are furthermore unable to employ regulative measures, so they will continue being exploited by these companies. Beyond just the people as well, the nation will be farmed for its natural resources. This causes insane environmental destruction, i.e. pollution, and this also prevents these countries from benefiting off their own natural resources,
TOI?
and it also prevents individuals from being able to survive off their own land, etc. No, thank you. The third response is that these countries are then trapped in a cycle. Developing countries never develop. I think it's a flawed assumption to assume that just because foreign direct investment happens, that these developing nations are able to benefit from it. And this is an impact of the previous two mechanisms. On our side, we get eventual development, even if it's slow, because A, people on the ground actually have an incentive to develop, and B, there are no external forces preventing development anymore. And I'll get more into this later on in my speech. If a country is constantly exploited, incentives for wealthy countries and wealthy individuals in these countries also have an incentive to keep the people poor because they can continue to exploit them. It is likely that opportunities will be restricted from people, so they have no choice but to continue to be exploited, i.e. education will not be funded and accessible. And this is important because education, for example, is one of the major ways that society is able to progress and countries are able to develop, because progression is often hinged on knowledge and skills. Furthermore, this also isn't limited to developing nations. Protectionist policies also protect citizens of developed nations, i.e. it prevents job loss because jobs aren't outsourced anymore. The rest of their benefits, stability, improving the lives of individuals, etc., all hinge on the first argument. But here are reasons anyways why stability actually gets worse on their side of the house. The first point then is political corruption. I think it's fairly obvious that political and economic elite are often intertwined. So for example, people who are rich can more easily bribe government officials, they can more easily lobby, they can more easily campaign for positions in office. Those that benefit from neocolonialism are going to remain at the top, and political corruption will occur because they want to stay at the top. In these countries, there's already a lot of instability. It is difficult to put a stop to corruption once it begins. There's an incentive to keep poor people in these countries poor, to continue to exploit them. These wealthy individuals who benefit from neocolonialism will never improve conditions for the rest of the country because that will inadvertently hurt them as well. The second point here is conflict, and this directly clashes with their argument on democracy. The mechanism, as suggested in the info slide, democratic norms is a big part of neoliberalism. So we'd say that countries that are more democratic would likely go into these countries and try and impose democratic values on these countries. And this is something opposition concedes to. Developed nations who care about democracy go into these developing nations to spread their democratic values, but in doing so, while they do tear down dictatorships, they just leave. And this creates a massive power vacuum. Like, look, dictatorships are bad, but the power vacuum that's left in its wake is worse. For example, gangs emerge to fill that vacuum. Civil wars result because there's conflict over who should be in power now, etc. Because these countries are already so unstable and they already lack a lot of support for citizens, it is extremely terrible for these countries to completely uproot their government, even if that government may be flawed, and create even more chaos, create even more instability. Violence is also born out of people being destitute and desperate. This happens when they're constantly taken advantage of because of these neoliberal policies. So proud to propose.
Thank you for that, Deputy Prime Minister. Now to rebuild for the case of the opening opposition, let's welcome Deputy Leader of Opposition. Here.
All right, very cool. I just want to give a quick thank you speech. Thank you to all the panelists and all the judges. This was a really well-ran tournament, and the biggest thank you of all to my partner, Nathan. I know it couldn't have been easy carrying me. I'll take POIs in the chat. I'll probably take one from CG. Okay. Speech starts in 3, 2, 1, now. There are two colorful worlds on both sides of the house. On government, it's a world racked with pain when families are unable to put food on the table because there are simply no jobs. On opposition, maybe it's the idea that you have a really terrible boss, but the crucial weighing is simple. Some job, maybe even bad ones, is better than no job at all, because some job means you can maybe put food on the table, and some job means there's still some amount of hope. There are going to be two things to get out of this speech. Firstly, which side gets more accountability? Second, who gets a better life for people on the ground? And we're going to win front half clash and just prove that's why Nathan's extension is round winning. Firstly, then, who gets more accountability? And under this, OG tells us an interesting idea that, there's a certain amount of inequality because you get things like economies of scale, the rich become richer, and you eventually just get foreign investment and a bunch of reasons why that is bad. The first response I have here is that we think it is better if wealthy democratic countries helm. And the reason is because at least we think there is some kind of accountability in that. Insofar, the vast majority of people from the westernized world is sympathetic. So they literally cannot abuse workers otherwise because people will not buy from them and they'll probably lose the profit they care about so much. But second, though, we think that these companies still care about their image and still care about how they're represented by the media. Why then are the comparatives on are going to be much worse? And we think it's two things then. Firstly, we think it's just without this motion, it's just going to be really small and uncompetitive companies who get in the developing world that are easily overshadowed by the huge westernized companies. That means there's a lack of goods being produced, prices are still pretty high, there's lack of innovation, people don't have jobs. That comparative is absolutely terrible. Or B, you have businesses that are state owned, which at the end of the day become much worse because the government lacks infrastructure and are oftentimes corrupt, which means workers are still likely to get abused or exploited. But the difference under here is that now with foreign investment, these foreign companies probably want these companies developing world to succeed, and they're probably willing to invest in a vast amount of money, which means you get more infrastructure and you get more innovation, and that is a benefit in of itself because we're able to prove long-term development that is fast, that is easy, and does not work under corruption. But we're also to help the most vulnerable people. More on that in this second theme then. But then all of this is to say that we think that exploitation gets worse on their side of the house because on our side there's just more competition, because now you have companies from the developing world and the developed world versus on their side where you have one natural monopoly, and we think that exploitation gets worse. That is absolutely round winning. We win the point on accountability. Second theme then, about who gets a better life for the people on the ground. We think that we do, and we should take this clash all over. Why is this true then? We think that by having some amount of competition and by having big companies, that means that one, people get jobs. This is what Nathan tells you, and jobs are important because that gives you a source of income, means you can put food on the table. It doesn't matter if it's a bad one, as long as you have a job, that is a margin that is better than what OG gives you and should put us a foot up. But second though, we think that with this competition, we think that with companies producing massive vast amounts of things, we think this also leads to things like innovation or perhaps cheaper prices, which at the end of the day all benefit the most vulnerable people in the developing countries who desperately need this. We get these things at any cost, and that is important. So maybe one or two people become incredibly rich on their side of the house, right? But that's not a bad thing at all, because presumably buying into their characterization that these rich company owners are profit incentivized, they will probably just build more factories, and that's good because that just equals more jobs at the end of the day. That just equals to more competition. I think we're still able to win on the theme as to who gets a better life for people on the ground. But before I move on to the past victory we have, I'll take a POI from CG if there is one. All right, cool. Seeing that there's not, let's move on to the path to victory. I think Nathan's arguments easily take this round of debate. Why? Because firstly, he tells you as to why foreign investment is going to happen. Because oftentimes companies want to find new ways of perhaps getting maximizing their profits. But in the developed world, there's already a huge amount of companies and just incredible amounts of competition. So wanting to so they want to expand. Therefore, they're going to go to developing countries. That is why it is likely. But then we also prove that's why we get more accountability in general. And that is more important because we explain as why the comparatives are much worse. So you can either end up with tiny companies that never innovate or never develop, or you're going to end up in the hands of the government, and that's where exploitation and abuse still happens. The difference, even in our absolute worst case scenario, is that exploitation still happens on either side of the house. At least we get it better because at least these massive companies are held accountable by the Western world. At least they still care about their image, and at least there's still better infrastructure and better efficiency, and at least you still have a job that is more stable, that is more long-term, that is more certain. Vote OO. Thanks.
All right, thank you for that, DLO. Now to open up the cases for the closing houses, let's first welcome member of the government. Here.
Okay, give me 1 second. Okay. All right. 3, 2, 1, go. Panel. The problem with neoliberalism is not just inherent in its specific structure, but we say it lies in the narrative that it paints globally and the specific type of pressure that it implements on other people to believe that this is the one best way to achieve political and economic success. We're going to talk about what this narrative is, how it's legitimized on a global scale, and the impacts that it has on widespread policies and the people on the ground. Let's first talk about this imposition and what it looks like. The imposition of neoliberalism, neoliberal world order, is this reliance on neoliberal theory as the best and perfect algorithm in order to solve political and economic issues. That this is the one best ideology that people should achieve, and especially when you get people like international organizations like the IMF or the United Nations, it legitimizes neoliberalism as the only and best way to govern your market and policies. So why then is this narrative so persuasive, and what does it lead to necessarily? One, it uses words based off democratic values that are based off just social equality, justice, and things of such, without actually having concrete ways to achieve such of those goals, right? So neoliberalism often will hide behind words like saying that even though we are pursuing free market and capitalism, capitalist theories, we still want to balance that with democratic values, and we still want to achieve social justice and social equality for everybody, but because the poor are still going to get some benefits from this free market and such. We say this then makes the narrative and the idea of neoliberalism very persuasive and very just attractive in general, and people buy into that because of the huge amount of legitimacy it has on a global scale. So then, what does this look like in policies that are being made and countries that buy into this idea? And note that this is where we fill in the mechanism for what OG tells you, right? Where OG will tell you about the specific, negative impacts of the actual imposition. We're going to tell you specifically why people buy into this narrative in the first place. Okay. Firstly, the impact that we're going to tell you is that we're going to get policies without accountability and evaluation into better alternatives. And what does this look like then? Well, one, we filled in the mech for the reason why imposition occurs in the first place. And it's the idea that policies are going to be just taken out and political decisions are going to be made without actually considering, major pitfalls or flaws or structural links that every country actually has in terms of like imposing a specific neoliberal decision or such, right? So what does that look like and how does it play out? Well, certain African countries have drastically reduced their healthcare budgets after getting like the IMF to legitimize and the World Bank to legitimize that neoliberalism is a good goal to pursue. We get other countries just making policies in where they're going to pursue privatization. They're going to cut down budgeting on just global like public sectors because they believe that in order to grow the economy and in order to help my country grow to be a stronger contender on a global scale, I should follow what is the most legitimate policy right now, without actually considering that certain countries actually have different needs, that people do require like public services, or that not all sectors of the economy or not all political decisions will benefit from neoliberal theory. We say that this is the biggest problem with the narrative of neoliberal theory, and it's this imposition that it's the best solution, it's the one-size-fits-all idea that makes it so that you get big sweeping policies like the wide-scale privatization of healthcare services in certain areas that make it so that it's much harder for certain people to specifically get access to healthcare on that basis. So then, what do we specifically tell you and how do we weigh over our opening? Well, opening tells you a few things. One, they tell you about how it makes it so that, Western countries, sure, I'll take your POI.
Your argument might work in debate land, but in the real world, countries negotiate with the IMF on what terms and services they accept. So neoliberalism doesn't have to be an exact copy of what it ought to be.
Even though we say that, sure, maybe policies will go through a process of negotiation, we still think that many countries buy into this idea and have this, make policies under the idea that neoliberalist theories are the most attractive. And we say it makes it so that it supersedes all other priorities that a country might have. Okay.
So let's talk about OG and why we weigh over them. Well, OG tells you about, things like such as conflict. They tell you about the problem in inequality and specifically the impact on developing countries and how they're forced into neoliberalism. We go beyond that and we tell you specifically beyond the idea that certain countries might be pressured into neoliberalist theories. We say that countries are actually persuaded into neoliberalism as the best idea so that they prioritize it as the biggest and most, impactful policies that they should make without actually considering other aspects of their country and other aspects that might be even more important to have a proper impact on the people. We're very proud to propose.
All right, thank you for that, MG. Now to open the case for the closing opposition, let's welcome member of the opposition. Here.
All right, just let me set my timer. Okay, I prefer she, her pronouns, verbal POIs. My time starts in 3, 2, 1. Throughout this debate, I think there's been a lot of discussion on whether or not neoliberalism is actually a good thing, but I don't think there's nearly been enough focus on what this motion is actually asking for, the comparative world of what it looks like with or without neoliberalism, and what this world looks like in either world, right? And the primary burdens of proposition are to prove why the imposition of neoliberalism is harmful, but more importantly, what is the comparative world should this imposition not exist, right? I think that OG is already a mediator out this debate when they completely fail to provide this, and CG only follows in their footsteps. In this speech, I'll be doing two things. First, I'm going to be providing a recharacterization of what neoliberalism is and exactly what it's offering, and the impacts behind this notion. And second, I'm going to be engaging in the comparatives, or moreover, the lack of it, and explain to you the harmful impacts of what happens when you remove neoliberalism throughout, the imposition of it throughout history. But before any of that, I think it's important to note that just because neoliberalism supports free trade and a lack of regulation regarding free trade, I don't think this means that we're going to have to support straight out human rights abuses or blatant exploitation, right? I think if government and bench can assume that the government suddenly has the ability to control the exploitation of workers, and that once you add regulations, somehow they're not going to be exploited, then I think we can also assume they have the power to ensure that basic human rights are followed, right? I think that just because there's a lack of regulation regarding production doesn't mean you can beat up or abuse your workers. And even if this is the case, I think that the fact that they are being offered jobs is still often better than the situation that many developing or poor nations are in. Yes.
What we told you is that sure, in the short run it benefits them, in the long run the country's stuck like this forever because now rich countries have incentive to keep them poor in order to continue exploiting them. Whereas on our side, they develop over time and gradually they climb out of poverty.
I think this is impossible to state because when you remove the idea of neoliberalism, there are very few countries and willing to invest in the very first place, right? I think that Western, or not necessarily Western, but major countries with a lot of, for example, investment power still have a vested interest in the development of developing nations because they want to get in on that economy early, right? They want to have an influence in that economy, and therefore it's beneficial to them if that turns out well. But I think that the fact of the matter is that when you simply just remove it as a whole, there's no one willing to invest in there in the first place. Hence, they'll be stuck in a situation even worse than they are now. I think that even in the worst case scenario, let's assume they don't get any better, at least it's better than a status quo where they have literally no investment, where they have literally no jobs in the first place. Okay? Now, but more than that, I think neoliberalism ensures that countries actually do not utilize the political power they have in order to unfairly restrict other nations. Now, what does this mean? I think that this means that, for example, even when the government's power changes and shifts, as long as they do not have much say regarding the market within the country, it means that the people's demands, jobs, and resources will not be affected despite this choice, right? It means that when there's war, conflict, etc., the government and their various tensions will not affect free trade and resources. I think that throughout history, despite all the problems it may have now, neoliberalism has been essential in reducing war and crime, especially because to be able to be capitalist and free trade has just generally greatly reduced poverty throughout history. And only when this picks up have countries actually been able to successfully improve their economies, right? And neoliberalism as a whole makes goods cheaper for consumers to purchase because it's more than just an individual nation, right? It's about free trade between nations. When you have neoliberalism, trade barriers like tariffs and quotas are reduced. Their natural competition reduces prices yet further for consumers, right? I think moreover than that, like I mentioned in the POI, it incentivizes companies to invest into foreign places in the first place because they know they can rely on the market and don't have to worry about their trade deal collapsing because the party backing it lost the election, right? I think this is especially applicable to, like, for example, emerging democracies, developing nations, as they often have unstable governments and high amounts of political corruption. The country is in a potential unstable state, right? You can only have cooperation between economies, and moreover, you can only boost economies when you trust that governments, often with their corruption slash political power slash powers, will not interfere with the development of the nation's jobs and productions, which is purely when it is purely driven by supply and demand and the needs of people. Can you truly effectively do it? But fine, let's talk about the comparative. What happens when you remove neoliberalism, right? No government team has provided an exact look of what this actually means. Okay, fine, let's assume that there is a gap, less of a gap between the rich and poor. But you know what? As a whole, everyone is poorer. The gap is less, but nobody is richer than they are now. Because when you have neoliberalism, even if the rich do become richer, the poor are still going to have better living conditions than they did before, right? I think that no government team has managed to successfully explain why exactly in their work, like, will these developing nations be able to develop in the first place? Because when there's government regulations, these have shown to be highly inefficient, as these places are often with highly corrupt governments, and therefore, even if there are government regulations, exploitation is likely to exist, and moreover, you won't get any foreign investment in the first place, hence leading to a lack of jobs. We think that rather government interventions make things far more difficult for both the market, foreign investors, and the workers themselves. Only by accepting a free trade society, even with all its problems, we can work to address them. Can we truly create a world in which people actually have the opportunities they need to grow and develop? For these reasons, we strongly support a closing opposition ballot. Please vote for us.
All right, thank you for that, member of the opposition. Now to end the case for the government, let's welcome Government Whip. Here.
All right, just gonna get my time ready. Okay. OP claims that competition is the best way to ensure that at the very least people have jobs, people can afford the goods they need. But the issue with this quote unquote natural competition is that neither OP team contended with how exactly prices are lowered and how exactly these jobs are opened, right? Because at the end of the day, in order for corporations to maintain a competitive edge, they always need to keep going lower, keep going cheaper than their competitors. That means cutting wages more, that means exploiting more workers, that means cutting down on safety measures and working conditions for these people. It means taking shortcuts and cutting corners in order to get to the point in which their products are affordable for the masses. On the basis that neither team contended with this, and their characterization of what natural competition actually does is incredibly unrealistic and one-sided. We're incredibly proud to propose. Okay, two things in my speech. Just firstly, going over like the op case and explaining why it doesn't stand, and then going over what Joy told you and explaining why CG takes this debate. Okay, briefly talking about CO. They basically give us like two biggest things. Firstly, talk about how the comparative is worse, and then secondly, on how like natural competition is beneficial. I think we've already largely on a general basis dealt with why this point on natural competition doesn't make sense, because sure, the end prices are more affordable, but what happens in between is still far worse for the most vulnerable actors. Sure, now toilet paper is like $3 cheaper perhaps than before, and even that is an extremely dramatic change. The issue is that the people who are working the people who are working in these factories, who are working in foreign countries at the end of the day, aren't the ones who reap these benefits, right? The people who are suffering the most harms from these reduced prices aren't the ones that are going to reap the benefits from it either way. We think it's still incredibly exploitative. We think it's still incredibly harmful. Secondly, they say that like on the comparative, these countries are going to remain in economic and political instability because no Western countries are going to be willing to invest in them in the first place when you don't adhere to neoliberal frameworks. Okay, couple responses to this. Firstly, we know that we don't think the only way for a country to improve like on an economic or a social or a political basis is necessarily to accept investment from private foreign corporations, right? We think there's a lot of ways to like improve the situation there, whether that's through like the IMF or through the UN or just through like grassroots efforts within the own country. But secondly, note that even if these efforts aren't enough, we think that investment from private Western corporations is far worse than investment like arguably less effective investment, but still investment that comes from a different place, right? Because we know empirically, we know for a fact that investment from private Western corporations is bad. We know that it's coercive. We know that it traps these countries it traps these countries under the hold of these Western countries and their corporations, right? At least on our side of the house, there's room for, at least in Gov's world, there's wiggle space. There's room for growth in the future, even if it's not as like glorified in the short term, just because the sheer amount of the pure amount of money or investment is lower. Okay, but what does Joy specifically tell you, right? She told you that it's not just about whether neoliberalism is good or bad, but about the imposition of it on an international worldwide level, right? She told you that it makes it two things. Firstly, that it's far more coercive for these developing countries, but she also gave you tangible impacts on this, right? She told you about how countries in Africa are cutting budgets to important public services like healthcare, and in theory, other countries cutting budgets to other important public services that, again, we think the most vulnerable people, the poorest people need access to, right? And who deserve access to. We think these are all things that come with this point of natural competition, that come with needing to adhere to neoliberal frameworks in order to get this kind of investment. We think there's a lot of trade-offs that neither option is really contended with. Sure, I'll take your point.
The reason why African countries had to cut back onto their spending costs in the first place was because natural monopolies were failing and they had no other way to provide for their citizens. Why is a world where only natural monopolies exist and a dictatorship exists going to be way better?
We don't think the alternative has to be that there are only natural monopolies or that they're dictatorships are just permanently in power, right? What we do know is that foreign investment or investment and Western corporations imposing themselves on these countries is incredibly harmful. But we think it's far easier. We think it's easier to garner things like entrepreneurship and economic development when these glorified Western corporations don't swoop in and claim massive swaths of land and political influence and workers and resources. Sure, maybe it starts off bad, but at the end of the day, we think it's infinitely more likely that we're able to improve the lives of people in this land when we have more accountability, when we give the power back to them. But secondly, what else does Joy tell you, right? Quickly. She also told you that it's infinitely harder to enact change, right? When DLO tells you that at least people have jobs, even though it's incredibly bad, it's exactly this narrative that the neoliberal world order imposes, right? That this is the only alternative, that this is the best way that we can go about things, that change is impossible. We think it's far easier on our side of the house to advocate for these rights and to enact change when it's not something that is glorified on a global scale. On that basis, we're proud to propose.
All right. Thank you for that, government whip. Now to end this debate, let's welcome opposition whip. Here.
Right, just to confirm, am I audible?
Yep, you're audible.
All right, thank you. So I would like to take verbal POIs. And if everyone is ready, my time starts in 3, 2, 1. Both of the government teams today have talked about how they don't want foreign investment, about how they will swoop in and steal all the jobs, all the workers. However, the most crucial mistake that both of these teams made is they never gave us an alternative. What does the world look like on their side of the house, and why will it likely to be successful? CEG comes up here and tells you that, yeah, they want to have slow short-term development, but in the long term will get better. However, that's simply not true given the extension that my partner gave you in terms of how the government is likely corrupt. They want money for themselves, which means they're more likely to exploit their resources, natural resources, for example, to make the maximum amount of profit in the short term. They don't invest this money into the industry because they don't simply care as much. I'll extend on that later in my speech. But just I would like to flag that because none of the government teams have a better alternatives on their house, we basically assume that they're defending a world in which basically you're just relying on the government for all the development. And I think that is simply not viable. I would like to move on to the clashes. I'll take the POI after the first clash. The first question in terms of basically just comparing corporations versus government on a local level, which one is able to benefit developing countries. What do the opening teams tell you? OG tells you simply that corporations are bad actors, that they're going to have monopolies, and that means they can have very high prices, low wages and are very harmful. However, firstly, OG provides no alternative. I think that on the other side of the house, developing countries are unlikely to have a lot of good corporations in the first place. OO, in response to OG, tells you that that they do want foreign investment. Foreign investment is good because you're able to provide more jobs. More jobs is better than bad jobs. However, I think that they were only able to argue on the basis of worker rights and weren't able to push that further to say why there will actually be better jobs and better development as a whole. This is where we're now able to overweigh our opening and also win this clash, because notice, what did my partner tell you in our extension? We tell you that, firstly, the government is a very bad actor because they're likely to be corrupt. They, as themselves, only care about making profit for themselves because, and in that case, they're willing to exploit their own natural resources more than corporations. On the other hand, corporations are less exploitative for two different reasons. Firstly, they want long-term profit. So that, for example, Tesla, they want to be sure that they can continue innovating over the years, rather than just like coming into like Indonesia, using all their nickel and then just leaving, because that is obviously unsustainable. The second thing is that corporations have an international image. Judge, profit is an international check and balance because everyone cares about money. Policies in the government, on the other hand, governments at best only care about their own citizens, and that means they're willing to exploit other people. I will talk about this later on more in my international clash. But at this point, Judge, I would just like you to notice that we were able to prove to you that A, corporations simply have better incentives to not exploit natural resources in developing countries, but secondly, they're more capable for long-term development. Why? They, as international corporations, have more budget simply to, for example, build factories, use higher technology, introduce in developing countries, etc. In addition, they're also able to teach skills. For example, uniquely, Tesla, like these individual companies are able to teach the workers in developing countries to help them develop in the long term.
POI.
Before I move on, I'll take that POI.
We agree with you that Western countries governments going to developing countries is awful, but don't you think that developing countries have an incentive, well, the governments to develop their own country so that they can, gain votes, become more popular, help their citizens?
Well, firstly, in many of these cases, they aren't necessarily democratic countries. But in addition, I think that even if the government wants to do that, they simply also don't have enough budget. You aren't able to like defend a world in which A, you don't want to sell natural resources to other countries because you claim like exploiting resources, and B, at the same time, you expect the government to have enough capability to develop the industry. We think that's not going to happen on your side. Given this, let's move on to the second clash point in terms of international exploitation of developing countries and how we prevent this. What is the crucial extension that my partner gave you in her speech? We tell you that on our side of the house, we have more stable trade for developing countries for three different reasons. Firstly, the trade is not affected by diplomacy, and it's only reliant on supply and demand, which means in cases where there's conflict, etc., developing countries aren't fully reliant on the countries, for example, who are in conflict, are now going to stop buying products from them. Secondly, we tell you you're going to reduce tariffs as part of free trade, which means that it is cheaper for developing countries to exploit their products into other countries. Even if it's not like the richest developed countries, they're also more able to sell products to their neighboring countries. The neighboring countries are more likely to sell than them. Overall, you're able to promote more cash flow. Lastly, we tell you corporations link production and consumer chains. It makes trade easier. Why is trade the most important thing here? Because we're able to tell you the impacts of this is that basically, it determines the general well-being of all industries. Because notice that in a world in which developing countries simply do not have enough capital to develop by themselves, you need international trade and cash flow. This is the argument that we did not receive any response from the teams, and we think this is the most crucial thing in the end. So at the end of the day, we believe that we should win today's debate because neither of the government teams were able to give you any good alternative. CG basically give you no unique extension, and at the end of the day, we're able to prove to you why you benefit the most crucial stakeholder of developing countries. Very proud to oppose.
All right, that's it. Thank you, opposition whip, for that speech. Thank you, debaters, for this round. You may now virtually cross the house and wait for the announcement later on after our deliberations. For the judges, please join me in the server 1, room 3 deliberation so we could deliberate there. Thank you very much, everyone. Again, Ayafa and Mohammed, please join me in the Discord room 3 in the server 1. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much. Good round all.
Thank you so much.